Starting in 1968, the rains over the Sahel, the semi-arid belt of Africa running along the southern edge of the Sahara, began to fail, and for the next 17 years, they barely came back. Crops collapsed. Cattle herds lost more than half their numbers. By the time the drought finally broke in the mid-1980s, close to 100,000 people had died, and the Sahara itself had crept roughly 100 kilometers further south than where it had stood before. Governments and aid agencies responded the only way anyone knew how. They planted trees, millions of them, shipped in from nurseries and planted by the truckload across some of the driest land on Earth. Almost all of them died. And while agronomists were still arguing over which imported seedling might survive the next drought, a farmer in a village in Burkina Faso, dismissed by his own neighbors as the village idiot, was quietly digging holes in ground so hard and dead that even the professionally planted trees couldn't take root in it. His only tools were a hoe, a pile of manure, and an idea everyone around him considered insane. Within a few decades, that idea, and a second one discovered independently a few hundred kilometers away, would help put close to 5 million hectares of dead Sahel farmland back into production, an area larger than Switzerland, without a single bulldozer or imported sapling. This is how a hole in the ground did what millions of trees and years of foreign aid could not. To understand why a hole in the ground mattered, it helps to see how bad the alternative was. Between 1968 and 1985, food production across the Sahel fell by an estimated 600,000 tons a year, year after year, while the population kept growing. Governments answered with the biggest tool in the development playbook: mass tree planting. Across Niger, Burkina Faso, and their neighbors, an estimated 60 million trees went into the ground through official reforestation campaigns in the 1970s and 80s. Fewer than 1 in 5 survived. In the worst-run projects, as many as 80% of the seedlings were dead within 2 months of planting, killed by heat, by goats, by weeks without a single hand to water them once the planting day photographs for the donor report had been taken. None of this was cheap. Growing a seedling in a nursery, trucking it to a village, and planting it costs real money, and multiplied across 60 million saplings, that adds up to a sum most of the affected governments could never have raised on their own, propped up instead by decades of foreign development aid. And still, the desert kept winning. By the early 1970s, surveys showed the southern edge of the Sahara had pushed roughly 100 kilometers further into farmland than where it had sat a decade earlier, swallowing fields that had fed people for generations. The disaster wasn't confined to one country. The drought hit a belt of 11 nations stretching from Senegal to Sudan, the same 11 that, decades later, would sign on to an even more ambitious plan, an 8,000-kilometer wall of trees called the Great Green Wall, meant to physically block the desert's advance. That project is still running today, with a target of restoring 100 million hectares by 2030. But it wasn't the wall of trees that actually turned the numbers around first. It was 2 men, working independently, a few hundred kilometers apart, who never coordinated and barely knew of each other's work. Set against that backdrop, the numbers this story eventually adds up to are almost hard to believe. Close to 5 million hectares of regenerated farmland in Niger alone. 200 million more trees standing today than stood there in 1980. An extra 500,000 tons of grain harvested every single year compared with the depths of the crisis, and roughly 2.5 million more people with something to eat because of it. None of that came from the 60 million trees the experts planted. All of it came from farmers refusing to accept that the dead ground in front of them was actually dead. The stakes were only getting higher while all of this played out. Niger's population has one of the fastest growth rates on Earth, driven by a fertility rate of 6 to 7 children per woman, and grew from 8.3 million people in 1990 to more than 26 million by 2023, on land that was losing productive capacity the entire time. Every hectare of hardpan that stayed dead wasn't just a historical loss from the 1970s drought. It was farmland a rapidly growing population needed back, every single year, just to keep up. The land itself was the real obstacle, and it was a harder problem than anyone planting saplings from a truck ever fully reckoned with. Decades of drought, Overgrazing and wind erosion had baked much of the exposed Sahel soil into a hard, crusted layer researchers call hardpan. A surface so compacted that rain, when it did fall, simply ran off the top instead of soaking in, carrying away what little topsoil remained with it. A tree seedling dropped into that ground had nothing to draw on. No stored moisture, no loose soil for its roots to spread through, and no protection from a sun that could kill a young sapling in days if nobody watered it by hand. Dennis Garrity, a senior fellow at the World Agroforestry Center who spent years studying the region, put the verdict on conventional reforestation bluntly. It was, in his words, a stupid way of restoring land in the Sahel. The imported approach had been designed for temperate climates and organized nurseries, not for hard-baked tropical soil and villages with no budget to water a seedling through its first 2 dry seasons. Many of the 60 million trees planted through official programs went into land with almost nobody living nearby to care for them at all, planted, photographed, and abandoned. Across parts of Niger and Burkina Faso, surveys in the early 1980s found this kind of hardpan crusting a significant share of farmland once considered productive. Land technically still owned and farmed by someone, but yielding next to nothing. The kind of ground aid workers had quietly started writing off as beyond saving. That was the wall. Not a lack of rain alone. The Sahel still received some rainfall most years, even during the worst of the drought. But a landscape that had lost its ability to hold on to whatever rain did fall. That left 2 questions nobody in the development world had a good answer for by the early 1980s. First, was there any way to get water to actually soak into ground this hard, cheaply enough that an ordinary farming family could manage it without a truck or a nursery? And second, was there anything already alive underneath that hopeless-looking dirt that could be worked with, instead of something new that had to be trucked in and kept alive by hand? The first answer came from a farmer, not a scientist. In the Yatenga province of Burkina Faso, starting around 1974, Yacouba Sawadogo began experimenting with an old technique nearly abandoned in his region, known locally as zai. Digging small pits across barren farmland during the dry season, then filling them with manure and compost before the rains came. The pits caught what rain there was instead of letting it run off, and the buried manure drew termites, which tunneled through the hardpan around each pit, breaking it open and letting water and roots penetrate soil that had been sealed shut for years. Farmers had used small versions of zai for generations to grow crops. Sawadogo's break with tradition was to dig his pits bigger and deeper than anyone was used to, and then, instead of only planting millet or sorghum in them, to let trees take root there too, something the older farmers around him considered pointless at best, on ground everyone already agreed was dead. Roughly a decade later, and a few hundred kilometers away, in the Maradi region of Niger, an Australian agronomist named Tony Rinaudo reached a very different insight while driving between villages in 1983. Rinaudo had spent years trying, and largely failing, to get imported tree seedlings to survive in the same kind of hard-pan soil Sawadogo was fighting in Burkina Faso. Stopping to look more closely at a patch of what everyone called empty scrubland, he knelt down and pulled back the dry grass and litter around one of the low, cut-back stumps scattered across it. Underneath, half buried, were fresh green shoots already pushing up from roots that, by every visible sign above ground, should not have still been alive at all. The ground wasn't empty. Beneath what looked like dead stumps and low bushes sat an enormous, invisible network of living tree roots, decades old in some cases, still alive underground, even though the visible trunks above them had long since been cut down or burned off for firewood. The trees weren't gone. They were waiting. Rinaudo's insight became a method now known as farmer-managed natural regeneration, or FMNR. Instead of planting a new sapling and hoping it survived, farmers could select the strongest shoots re-sprouting from an existing root system, prune away the weaker ones with a simple knife, and protect the survivor from grazing animals and fire while it grew. The root system, doing the actual work of finding water underground, had already been alive for years, sometimes decades, underground everyone had already given up on. No nursery or truck required, because the hardest part of growing a tree in this soil had already been done, years earlier, by the tree that used to stand there. Two farmers, working independently on two different techniques in two different countries, had landed on the same underlying answer. The Sahel's dead-looking land wasn't dead. It just needed a reason, and a small amount of help, to prove it. Sawadogo's neighbors did not see a breakthrough. They saw a man wasting his labor on ground everyone had already written off, digging what looked like an eccentric, oversized version of a technique the rest of the village considered outdated. Village chiefs openly opposed him. He was mocked as the village idiot, and at least once someone burned part of the young forest he had spent years coaxing out of barren ground, apparently out of pure resentment at what he was doing. He kept digging anyway, through most of the 1970s and 80s, expanding his pits year after year on land nobody else wanted, with no institutional backing and no guarantee any of it would work. Rinaudo's idea met a quieter but just as real kind of resistance: institutional indifference. Development agencies at the time were built around growing and distributing seedlings. That was the entire reforestation industry's business model. The thing donor reports were built to measure and fund. Telling farmers to prune existing stumps instead of planting new trees didn't fit that model, cost almost nothing to implement, and for years struggled to get the attention or funding that flashier tree planting campaigns received. A method built around not spending money on saplings is, from a certain institutional angle, a hard thing to get excited about. The turning point for both ideas came from the same brutal source: another famine. In 1984, drought struck the Sahel again, hard enough that the aid organization Rinaudo worked with, serving in mission, launched a food-for-work program that paid farmers in food to practice FMNR on their own land while the crisis was underway. Roughly 70,000 people were introduced to the technique through that program alone, across some 12,500 hectares, not because anyone had been fully convinced it worked yet, but because there was a famine happening and nothing else on offer cost as little. In Burkina Faso that same decade, drought did what years of mockery couldn't. In 1990, a bad harvest year across the region, farmers around Sawadogo's village, who had copied his zai pits, brought in a real crop, while everyone else's fields failed. 13 farmers from Niger's Tahoe region had visited his fields the year before, in 1989, specifically to see the technique for themselves. When their own zai-pitted fields were the only ones in the area that produced anything worth harvesting in 1990, they went home converts, and the method began spreading into Niger on its own, farmer to farmer, with no development agency running the campaign at all. Strip away the mockery and the decades of resistance, and the actual mechanics of both techniques are almost defiantly simple, closer to something a family could do with hand tools over a dry season than an engineering project. A zai pit starts in the dry season, months before any rain is expected, when the ground is at its hardest. Using a hoe or pickaxe, a farmer digs a pit roughly the width of 2 hands and about as deep, spacing pits in a grid across the degraded field. Manure or compost goes into the bottom of each one, which does 2 things at once. It feeds the soil directly, and it draws termites, whose tunnels riddle the compacted hardpan around the pit, and open channels for water to penetrate ground that would otherwise shed every drop of rain that touched it. When the rains finally come, each pit acts like a tiny reservoir, catching runoff that would have simply washed across the surface and funneling it straight down to the roots of whatever is planted there: millet, sorghum, or, in Sawadogo's version, trees. A related technique called a half-moon, or demi-lune in the French used across the region, does the same job at a larger scale. A shallow, crescent-shaped basin dug into a hillside or open field, angled to catch rainfall and sheet runoff across a much wider area than a single zai pit, often used to reclaim larger stretches of bare, sloped land in a single season. Farmer-managed natural regeneration works on a completely different mechanism, because it isn't about capturing water at all. It's about managing what's already growing underground. A farmer walks their field after the rains and identifies stumps or low woody growth sending up new shoots, the visible sign of a root system still alive beneath the surface. Rather than clearing this growth, as generations of farmers had been taught to do to keep fields clear for planting, the farmer selects the strongest 1 or 2 stems per stump, prunes away the rest with a simple knife or machete, and protects the survivor from grazing livestock and accidental fires while it grows. One species in particular became the favored target across Niger's parklands, Phytherbia albida, a native acacia known locally as gao, which happens to do the opposite of what a farmer would expect a tree to do. It drops its leaves at the start of the rainy season, exactly when crops beneath it need the sunlight most, and grows a new canopy during the dry season instead. Because it sheds nitrogen-rich leaves onto the soil every year and hosts bacteria that pull nitrogen straight out of the air, a dense stand of mature gao trees can add fertility equivalent to roughly 50 tons of manure per hectare annually, and researchers have measured millet grown underneath it, yielding 2 to 3 times more grain than millet grown in open, treeless fields nearby. Farmers weren't just growing trees back. They were rebuilding a fertilizer factory that had been standing there the whole time, cut down for firewood one generation at a time. Scaling either technique from one farmer's field to millions of hectares took organization neither Sawadogo nor Rinaudo could provide alone. That work fell later to programs like the World Food Programme's Integrated Resilience Program, running in Niger since 2014 in partnership with the FAO, IFAD, UNEP, UNICEF, and the UN's own Desertification Agency. Rather than trucking in aid, the program pays participating households through cash for assets and food for work schemes to dig zai pits and half-moons on their own degraded land, combines that labor with composting, smallholder market support, and school feeding programs run through the same villages, and lets each community decide which of its own fields to prioritize first. Across some 2,000 villages, the program has rehabilitated more than 317,000 hectares of degraded land since 2014, using exactly the same hand-dug techniques Sawadogo and Rinaudo had been testing on their own decades earlier. This time with a budget, a coordinating body, and a name. A Nigerian farmer working with the WFP program today walks through roughly the same sequence Sawadogo worked out alone in the 1970s. Assess a degraded plot, dig pits or half-moons through the dry season, add manure, wait for the first rains, and replant. The difference is that the same farmer can now also draw a cash-for-work wage while doing it, sell surplus grain from the reclaimed plot at a village market the program helped connect to buyers, and send a child to a school meal program funded from the same project, turning a technique built to save one man's field into something closer to a functioning local economy, rebuilt one restored plot at a time. None of this required a single bulldozer, an imported seedling, or a foreign engineering firm. It required a hoe, a knife, manure, and, in both cases, one person willing to keep digging through years when everyone around them was certain it wouldn't work. Add up what these two farmer-led ideas actually produced, decades later, and the numbers are larger than almost anything the original tree planting campaigns achieved. In Niger's Maradi and Zinder regions alone, farmer-managed natural regeneration has been credited with regreening close to 5 million hectares of farmland, an area bigger than Switzerland, and putting an estimated 200 million more trees on the landscape than existed there in 1980. That regrowth translates into real food on real tables. Researchers studying the region have credited FMNR with an extra 500,000 tons of cereal harvested every year compared with the depths of the 1970s and 80s crisis. Enough of a difference that an estimated 2.5 million people are now considered more food secure than they would otherwise be. The zai and half-moon side of the story shows up in a different set of numbers. The World Food Programme's Niger program alone has rehabilitated more than 317,000 hectares of degraded land since 2014, and WFP describes the broader effect in blunt terms. Hundreds of thousands of people who once depended on food aid every lean season no longer need it, because the ground beneath their own villages is producing again. None of this came from a single coordinated master plan. It came from two separate techniques, discovered independently, adopted first by desperate farmers during famine years, and only organized into a funded program decades after they had already proven themselves in the field, one hand-dug pit at a time. It's worth setting that against the Great Green Wall, the far more famous initiative that 11 Sahel nations formally launched in 2007, aiming to plant a literal 8,000-kilometer band of trees across the width of the continent to physically hold the desert back. By 2018, the project had restored close to 20 million hectares and created more than 350,000 jobs across its member countries. Real numbers, on a scale the original wall of trees concept never quite achieved on its own terms. The program remains well short of its target of 100 million hectares by 2030, and much of its own funded work today runs through exactly the same farmer-led methods this story has been telling. The wall of trees, as originally imagined, mostly didn't get built. Reviews of the initiative more than a decade in found financial barriers, poor coordination between the 11 member governments, and a persistent gap between the money announced at international conferences and the money that actually reached farmers on the ground, prompting officials in some member countries to ask publicly where the promised funding was actually going. What got built instead, quietly, farm by farm, was something closer to what Sawadogo and Rinaudo had been doing with a hoe and a pruning knife since the 1970s and 80s, decades before anyone gave it an official name or a line item in an international budget. Sawadogo lived to see the vindication. In 2018, 30 years after his own province had called him insane, he received the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes described as the Alternative Nobel Prize, for the same zai pits that had once gotten his forests set on fire. 2 years later, the United Nations Environment Program named him a champion of the earth. He died in 2023, by which point the technique he had been mocked for had spread across 2 countries and helped regreen an area measured in millions of hectares, not the 40 he had started with on his own land. None of what actually worked in the Sahel required new technology. The termites that break open hard-pan soil around a zai pit had always been there. The root systems beneath Niger's empty-looking scrubland had been alive the entire time, waiting underground everyone had agreed to call dead. The rain that half-moons and zai pits capture is the same rain that used to run straight off the same fields and disappear. It had to be noticed by people willing to trust what was already in front of them over what an outside expert had decided the land could no longer do. That's a harder lesson to fund than a tree planting campaign, and a harder one to put in a donor report. Sometimes the most effective response to a landscape everyone has given up on isn't to import a solution from somewhere else, but to ask the people who have farmed that same dirt for generations what they've noticed that nobody funding the rescue effort ever bothered to ask. Sawadogo asked that question with a hoe. Rinaudo asked it by getting out of his vehicle and pulling back the grass around a stump nobody else had looked at twice. Both answers were sitting in ground that every expert with a budget had already written off as finished. If stories like this, where the land written off as dead turns out to have been alive the whole time, are your kind of thing, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.